Hello and welcome to my channel. In this one I'm going to be drawing a lovely countryside scene with some colored pencils. I'm going to start by sketching out the upper edge of the mountains in the distance. The size of the paper is not very large, about 6 times 10 inches or so. I just need to pick the right color for the sky. In my reference, which is going to be in the description, the sky is kind of dull, light grayish color. I want something a little bit more bluish, a little bit more vibrant. So I picked up a light phthalo blue. I'm going to start with that. And I'm going to put that down very lightly. But I will try to cover most of this area in the top left part of the scene. After that I'm going to do some blending, and on this surface I prefer to blend with stiff bristle brushes, especially with a cropped tip. They really push the pigment into the grain of the paper. The paper, by the way, is UART 800 sanded paper. On top of that I'm going to use some light cool gray. So because it's a cool grey color, it goes well with the bluish tones underneath, because it has itself a bit of a bluish component to it. But I'm doing this because I want to make the sky a bit lighter and a bit duller. After that, I'm going to work on those distant mountains. We have several layers of those slopes and hills in the distance. The ones which are furthest away from our viewpoint are going to be kind of bluish. So I'm going to start with Prussian blue. The Prussian blue is a little bit darker. It's a darker blue, but I'm going to make it a bit lighter because I'm going to work on top of that with a lighter pencil. What I'm trying to achieve with this lighter bluish pencil, and this pencil I'm using has a bit of a greenish component to it. This is a light turquoise, bluish turquoise color. What I'm trying to accomplish with it is to make the mountains a bit lighter, but also to soften that texture a little bit. And then I added a little bit of green to that as well. Now I'm drawing the outline or the edge of the forested area on one of the plains, on one of the slopes in the distance. And for that I'm using a darker green this time. On one of those slopes, the grass, on one of those bare areas where there are no trees, the grass is kind of yellowish, so I introduced some yellowish tones and then added a little bit of green as well. I'm using a light yellowish green and a little bit of yellowish gold color. Now for this wooded area, I need to cover it with some darker green, and I'm going to want to create some suggestions of trees or groups of trees in there. I'm using a permanent olive green, which is a slightly darker green with a bit of a yellowish component to it as well. This middle part I can just cover that a little bit more quickly. I don't have to worry about the texture. And I'm going to blend it with a brush. I like to use a couple of different brushes so that I wouldn't muddy the colors. So once I lay down that base color, that base green color, I'm starting to introduce some slightly darker details. I'm using a black pencil, and what I want to accomplish with this, I want to add some shadow areas, because when you look at groups of trees at a distance, they look like a bunch of very small, lighter and darker shapes, because some parts of the canopies are catching a bit of light while others are in the shadow. And there is also shadow between groups of trees. So what I'm trying to do is maybe break up that large, darker shape into smaller shapes that kind of look like clusters of trees. And here on the edge I want to have some smaller trees which are detached from the rest, or maybe smaller groups of trees scattered across that part of the slope which is mostly grassy with very little trees. I'm continuing to work on those distant mountains. I put down the darker color first, and then I blend on top of that with a lighter color. One of the best methods of blending on this surface is using lighter colors on top of the darker ones. And now I'm continuing to work on the appearance of those distant trees covering those slopes. The reason why the mountain peaks in the distance are bluish is because I'm trying to imitate the atmospheric effect. The further away something is, it's going to appear less detailed, there's going to be less contrast, and it's going to be a little bit more bluish in color. Whereas the stuff that is closer to the foreground is going to be more detailed, it's going to have more texture, more contrast, and it's going to have more vibrant colors as well. I'm also adding some lighter details with a lighter green to have a little bit more variation in value in that large group of trees. Here I decided to draw the shape of that dirt road, which is going to be one of the main elements of the foreground section of the landscape. Now there's another slope here leading down to that road, so connecting the background and the foreground area. And it's mostly just green, but to make it a bit more interesting, I added some yellowish and some ochre tones, because I want a little bit more variation in color, not just in value. So now I'm going to do a bit of blending with a brush again. As you can see on this surface, you can blend. The color pencils I'm using are Faber Castell Polychromos, but it doesn't really matter which ones you're using. It is the surface that allows you to blend and layer better than you normally would be able to on regular paper, because sanded paper behaves differently, or rather colored pencils behave differently on sanded paper than they do on regular paper. There is more residue, colors are more vibrant, they're easier to blend, they're easier to layer. You can work from dark to light and from light to dark. Moving closer to the foreground area, adding some more of the green, and then doing some more blending. Now there's going to be a fence. There's going to be a fence in the midground, a little bit further back, away from that road. And there's going to be another fence, or maybe it's the part of the same fence, closer to the road. So these shapes that I'm drawing in the distance, they're obviously smaller and less detail, just like a bunch of lines, but I'm still trying to imitate the appearance of an old wooden fence with some posts and rails, some of which look to have maybe fallen down or are a little bit crooked. So I want to make it look like it's an old wooden fence, slightly dilapidated and in a poor state of repair, I suppose. This foreground area here is interesting because it's a lot darker in value, so I'm going to have to use darker green. And from what I can tell from the reference, it's darker green. It's darker because it's a shadow area, and the shadow is coming from the trees on the opposite side of that dirt road. It is the canopies of the trees which are casting some shadows onto this part of that grassy area. I added some darker green and a little bit of black colored pencil, and finally I blended that with a brush. It doesn't look like much, but once I do all of the other shadows and once I draw that row of trees, it's going to start to make a lot more sense, I think. Right now I'm going back and just adding some random details to that grassy area on that slope to the left, because I want a bit more variation in the terrain, maybe like some dips in the terrain, maybe some shadow areas, maybe some areas of taller grass, some larger clumps of grass, bushes, whatever. Just a little bit of variation in the terrain so that it's not just a simple, smooth, grassy slope. So I don't have to do too much, but with just a few suggestions I can create that illusion of detail, which can be enough to convince the viewer that they're looking at a grassy area. And now I'm adding some details to this shadow area in the foreground using a darker green pencil. Like I said, I'm using a permanent olive green. That's going to be my main darker green pencil for those darker green areas. And now I'm using some black colored pencil to draw this slightly darker area, because there appears to be like a smaller path joining this dirt road from the side, and there's a little bit of shadow there between the grass. And then finally I'm starting to draw that fence. I'm going to start with one of the posts using a combination of brown and black. These rails which are sticking out on the side, they're a little bit darker than the post itself. So I'm just going to continue drawing these shapes, but I'm going to want to throw in some lighter details as well, because the upper edge of those posts will be catching, and those rails will be catching a bit of light from above. So I used a light grey for that, and I'm trying to create a bit of contrast between those lighter and darker parts of the fence, so that I would make it look a bit more three-dimensional, and so that I would make it stand out against the terrain even better. Just adding a little bit more of that light grey. And one of the things that you'll notice here is that I'm actually able to put in those lighter marks on top of the darker layers. This is not what I would normally be able to do on regular paper, but UART is pretty much like other sanded papers. It allows you to put in multiple layers. There's another thicker post here. I'm going to draw that one as well, a little bit darker with a bit more black colored pencil. So back to what I was talking about, the surface. UART is a sanded paper which allows you to layer, and it works really well with colored pencils. I think it's more suitable for pastels, and you can certainly draw some wonderful landscapes in pastels. I've done a number of those on my channel, but this time I felt like using colored pencils because there are lots of details in this one, and I feel like only colored pencils can draw these tiny details and produce these fine textures. I'm adding some more details here on this grassy area. Now I'm going to do this road here. I'm going to start with a little bit of light grey and maybe add a touch of blue here and there. I want a couple of different colors, and I'm adding a little bit of ochre as well in some places. I'm especially going to add more ochre here on the side of the road. Now I'm going to add some slightly darker tones, a little bit of brown. And I'm just dragging my pencil, allowing it to produce some random texture and some random variation in value. Finally, I'm adding a little bit of black colored pencil on top. Again, just dragging the pencil, using mostly a circular and a back and forth motion, short, tiny strokes. And I'm kind of making sure that here in the distance I make smaller marks, but as I go closer to the foreground area I make slightly larger marks. That's because the objects in the foreground are going to appear larger. Finally, I'm going to add some more deliberate marks, like some suggestions of shadows under the smaller rocks, pebbles, or lumps of dirt. And naturally the ones that are closer to our viewpoint are going to appear larger. You always have to pay attention to the relationship of the objects in the scene to the viewpoint. Now I'm adding a little bit of lighter color at the top of some of these small objects to make them stand out more, to make it look like they're sticking out. And to make that surface of the dirt road look more uneven. Now there are going to be some nice shadows here going across the road. These shadows are coming from those trees on the right side. That's at least how I interpret it. And to draw these shadows I'm simply going to add a little bit of value on top of that dirt road in a few places. I don't really need to do much more than that. Just a few of those horizontal lines, and I kind of want to make them look sort of semi-transparent, I suppose, so that some of that texture under them is still visible. I often use that term texture. I'm referring to the small marks and variations in value that are produced by the pencil, that I have no control over. It's something that just happens. But what I do have control over is the amount of texture, because I can soften it by blending or layering, or I can just leave it to achieve a certain effect, because it is the texture that creates the illusion of detail. And I use that illusion of detail to make parts of the foreground appear more detailed to the eye of the viewer. I'm doing some more work on the fence now, drawing some of these posts and rails. And as you can see, their shape is a little bit crooked, a little bit irregular, which is fine because I want it that way. I want it to look like an old wooden fence. And adding a little bit more shadow on the grass at the bottom. Now I'm moving on to this part of the foreground in the middle, where I'm going to draw the rest of these mountains in the back. Again, I started with a bit of Prussian blue, and then I layered a lighter blue pencil on top of it. That creates that bluish atmospheric effect of the distant mountains. After that, I moved on to drawing these hills and slopes in the distance, similar to the left side. Here also we have some of those yellowish tones on those bare parts of the mountain. Maybe it's a dry yellowish grass there. The rest of it is covered with a lot of trees. And because these trees are so far away, I won't really need to bother too much trying to define their shapes. I'm just going to lay down the base color, that permanent olive green that I used initially, and then do some blending with a brush. And then I'm going to add some darker details, some shadow areas using a black colored pencil. Once again, I am dragging the pencil, allowing it to produce a little bit of random texture. But it's not entirely random because I choose to add a bit more of the darker color in some places than in others. So basically I'm creating variations in value but also variations in texture. Where the texture is too much, I just go over it with a slightly lighter pencil, in this case a dark green, and I soften the texture, because in those distant objects you don't want to have too much texture because they're further away, so they're going to need to appear less detailed. So you might want to soften the texture any way that you can. The best way to soften the texture is to layer lighter pencils on top of the darker ones. You can also blend with brushes, and that also works to a certain extent. Here I'm adding a little bit of darker value, defining that transition between that lighter part of the slope and the wooded area, which is a little bit darker. There is a tree here in the midground, pretty much in the middle of the scene. I first used a little bit of a light green pencil, and now I'm going over that with a black pencil to create some foliage and some shadows on it, and to define the shape of its canopy a little bit better. This tree is a little bit larger, obviously, than the objects in the background. And now I'm going to draw some foliage in the top right part of the scene, because we're going to have some trees popping into the scene from this right side. Those are the trees that are growing on the right side of this dirt road, and those are the ones that are casting those shadows to the left. There are a few more trees here in the distance. These are a little bit smaller than the one in the middle, or maybe groups of trees. So the trick when you're drawing these landscapes where you can see far into the distance is creating that feeling of depth and distance. And one of the ways to do that is to vary the size of the objects in relation to their position, based on our viewpoint, because the trees that are closer to our viewpoint are going to be larger, and the ones that are further away are going to appear much smaller. The trees in the distance also had a little bit of shadow being cast from right to left, which is a nice detail that I had to include. And now I'm just adding a little bit more of those details on the fence, a little bit more of those vertical posts, and doing the rest of the fence on the other side as well. I'm going to add a little bit of shadow under it as well, and make the grass a little bit darker. Now I'm using a light blue pencil to draw some parts of the sky which will be visible through the canopies of these trees on the right. So the canopies, now I'm applying a little bit of grey, the canopies will not be obscuring the sky entirely. There are holes, lots of holes in those canopies, and you can see the light of the sky behind it through them. So first I defined some of those lighter areas, and now I'm going to be working around them, drawing the foliage with a dark green pencil that I used for the wooded area in the back. I'm wiggling my hand, mostly using a back and forth motion, but also varying the angle and the pressure. And then I'm doing the same thing with a black colored pencil, working on top of that, producing even more variation in values and shapes, creating an illusion of foliage as seen from a distance. Because when you look at the foliage from a distance, you will see a combination of a very large number of tiny lighter and darker shapes. And to produce that texture, to produce that illusion, you can use a darker pencil on top of a lighter one like this, going over it randomly, allowing it to create a random texture and some random detail. But again, it's not entirely random, because in some places I simply apply a bit more of the black pencil, creating those larger, darker shadow areas. Those will be the areas or parts of the canopy where less light is coming through. Here I'm going to draw a little bit more of the fence on the right side. Normally I would first do the train and then draw the fence, but here I decided to draw at least some of these shapes because, I don't know, I just felt that I needed to figure out that part of the composition, because if you compare this to the reference photo, you will see that the right side of my scene is a little bit stretched out. The aspect ratio of my drawing and the reference photo is a little bit different. So I had to add a little bit more grass here on the right side, but that's okay, these minor changes don't really matter. I also drew some of these parts of the tree trunk and branches which will be visible through the canopy. So I don't want all of them to be visible, which is why I drew these interrupted shapes. And the shapes will be interrupted by a bunch of foliage. And then I'm going to be drawing with this dark green pencil. Make no mistake, this part of the drawing process can be a little bit repetitive and tedious and takes a bit of patience, because if you just go for larger, broader strokes, you will create an ugly looking texture that will be a little bit more difficult to fix later. This is especially the case around the edges or the outer outline of the tree, where you have to pay more attention to those smaller shapes. In the middle, not so much, because you're going to be reworking it anyway. So now I'm working on the grassy area to the right side of the road. Here I decided to apply a little bit of the lighter green pencil first, and then I'm using some dark green. I'm putting in some dark green details on top of that to create a little bit of variation and also to add suggestions of those shadow areas. I'm mostly, when I draw that grass, I'm mostly drawing vertical shapes, but I'm varying the angle a little bit, and I'm also varying the size because the grass that is closer to our viewpoint has to appear larger and taller. After that I soften everything with a brush, both in the background but also a little bit in the foreground as well. Now I'm going to continue working on this tree, adding some more shadow areas between the larger clusters of foliage. And I'm doing that with a black pencil. I'm not going to cover the whole thing with a black pencil. I'm just going to graze over certain areas. But in other areas I will stay a little bit longer, use a bit more pressure and create some darker and larger shadow areas. Those will create an illusion like some parts of the canopy are deeper in the shadow of the canopy, while others are sticking out and catching more light from the light source. That's at least the effect that I'm trying to achieve. Now after that I will use a little bit of dark green. The darkest green that I used here was a pine green, and it's a very dark green, but on top of that, especially on the right side, I used a little bit of light green. This light green pencil is just called light green. The reason why I'm using it is to soften a bit of texture, but also to make some parts of the canopy on the right side a bit lighter, because it needs to be a bit lighter, because that part of the canopy is obviously more exposed to the light source. This right side is a little bit further away from the light source and it's a little bit darker, which is why I'm going over it one more time with a black pencil. Now you will notice there are multiple trees in that row, and these canopies are kind of merging into one mass of foliage. That's okay, because I don't really have to try to define the shape of every individual canopy. I can just leave it like this, because if you look at the reference you will see a similar thing basically, because you can't really make out where one canopy ends and the other one begins. There's another interesting looking tree here in the middle, a little bit lower down, further down that road, with a slightly bent and crooked shape. And this one also has to be darker than the rest of the background so that it would stand out against the lighter colors of that slope in the back. I'm also adding some yellowish details to this grassy area, and what I want to achieve with that, I want to make it look like the sun is coming through some parts of those canopies and making the grass at the bottom look a little bit lighter and a little bit warmer. With a black colored pencil I'm adding some shadow areas on that grassy area, but also this part of the dirt road which is closer to the grass is also going to be darker here on the right, because the grass itself is slightly raised above that part of the terrain. It's going to be casting a bit of shadow onto that part of the road. So I think I achieved some nice and, more importantly, logical looking shadows, and now I'm adding a little bit of yellow to the canopy. I also need a few bushes here in the back, just to fill that part of the terrain with some detail. So I drew some shapes of bushes, and I'm also adding some shadow under these trees Now that I've done that, I need to rework the shape of the fence, so I'm adding some lighter details on some of these posts and rails so that they would stand out against the darker shapes of the trees as well as the shadows on the ground under them. Just applying a little bit of more dark green on these bushes in the back, and the scene is almost done, as you can see. I'm adding some tiny marks with a light green pencil to make the grass look a bit more detailed, just adding a few lighter blades of grass here and there where I can see that they will stand out nicely against the background, and just finishing the rest of the fence here on the right side. Don't forget to subscribe, by the way, and give me a like and comment. Let me know what you think. And more importantly, don't forget to check out my other videos because I have lots of content on my channel. I have a lot of landscape videos, both in colored pencil and in some other media. I'm going to put my signature on the left side here in the lower left corner. So there it is. The drawing is now done. I hope you like it, and I hope you enjoyed the drawing process. This one was a little bit longer. If you want to see the full-length version of this video and many others, you should check out my Patreon. Bye bye.